Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Doug Grossman, for those who don't know me, and this is our third annual Glen Bowen Memorial Symposium. Just briefly about Dr. Bowen. He grew up in Provo, majored in English at Utah State University, and then received his MD from University of Utah and did a residency in dermatology at the University of Michigan. He was a skin surgeon. Let's see, the slides aren't advancing. There we go. He was a skin surgeon in our department and at HCI for 20 years. Beyond this, he had so many talents. I've listed some of these here. He was known for combining this tireless work ethic with the ability to see humor in everyday circumstances. There was really no one in the department who didn't appreciate the excellent surgical care that he provided to their patients, or value his mentorship and friendship, marvel at his presentations, in which he was able to simplify complex concepts with creative visual imagery, or wasn't captivated by his entertaining stories. Glenn took the time to write letters. Who does this anymore? I saved a number of these, but he remembered details about his patients. You see all the areas I had to black out here, just that would be identifying information. He knew about the patients. He knew the names of their kids, knew their hobbies, and he was able to establish these relationships with them. And he really appreciated the trust in his colleagues in referring patients to him. And so he would write these letters when he'd refer patients to him. This is the display we currently have outside of our Mohs lab at HCI to commemorate Glenn. And he was known for so many things, not only his talents as a surgeon, but he was a great teacher and a great mentor, and was really appreciated by everyone. This is an extraordinary portrait by one of our former residents. Should we turn the lights down in front? Can we do that? The photos will show up better. A portrait of Glenn by Agnesa Goodson, who is one of our former residents. And as everyone knows, Keith, Jessica, and Alice were all former trainees in our department and really were inspired by Glenn, and today continue that tradition of surgical excellence at HCI. To his patients, he was both their friend and their healer, putting them at ease with his humor. These were his classic jokes. He would tell this patient that they needed temple work. He would tell this patient that they had something to get off their chest. The patients with seborrheic keratoses, he would tell them not to worry, these were just barnacles on their ship on the sea of life. And he would tell a patient like this, don't worry about this excision, it's no skin off his back. So Glenn used humor to put patients at ease, and really was able to communicate to them that he really cared about them. And that's something that they always remembered. In return, patients showered him with gifts. And these range from the incredibly beautiful things like this handmade quilt to the bizarre. This patient made him a toilet paper holder. So Glenn, really before it was fashionable, was an early champion of multidisciplinary care. He started both of the melanoma and CTCL multidisciplinary conferences at HCI. And he really felt that the patient was best served by having input from multiple physicians and related specialties. And he ran these conferences. Everyone's input was important, and he thought that was always in the best interest of the patient. I thought really was also a reflection of his humility, because he knew he didn't know everything, and he could always benefit from input, and was never hesitant to ask for help when he had a difficult case. Glenn would work off a tablet, and he always had to be doing something. He always had to be scribbling or doodling. And this is just an example of one of the cases while it's being discussed, a patient with satellitis, and he's drawing pictures of the satellites. And at one time we had a clinical trial called the green peptide trial, and he's drawing the cat in the hat and talking about green eggs and ham. So this is kind of an example of just how he which is so entertaining for everybody. Glen was a problem solver. He loved solving problems. He couldn't sit still. Between Mo's cases, he'd love to work crossword puzzles. This must have been a not too busy day if he finished this one. Glen also liked to solve problems in the clinic. He helped me a number of times, got me out of a number of jams. Here he's suturing my finger that was cut and allowed me to get back into the clinic that same day. Glen loved Halloween. Some of you remember he would invite the whole clinic over his house for Halloween parties, and he was kind of the master of ceremonies and just loved entertaining everyone and seeing everyone be happy. This one year I brought my younger daughter there, Rachel, and I'd never seen her laugh so hard. That was Glen sort of entertaining the group. We were playing this Pictionary game, which is kind of a charades and pictures. Glen loved exploring the natural wonders of Utah. Here's some older photo. You recognize your colleagues in our department here from 20 years ago. And so Glen loved being outside, loved Utah. And so I would just say the next time you're outside, skiing, hiking, enjoying the great things in the state, you can think of Glen. So this is what Glen would say whenever you bounce an idea off of him, or I think that's what he'd say as he hears the talks. If he was hearing the talks today, we'd always just say, that's way interesting. So our program today, and Jessica is fighting the snowstorm coming from Park City. So she's not here yet, right? So we're gonna change the order, and we're gonna hear a video from Scott, who couldn't be here today, but prepared some personal remembrances. So let's see. How do we start it? No. No, is that it? There we go.
A few years before COVID, the dermatology department was gathered at a retreat. And during one of the breaks, Glen came up and asked me what I was reading. I told him I had just finished some stuff on the Revolutionary War, and that I was looking to get some books on the Civil War, as I really hadn't had anything on the Civil War since college. And so he immediately and enthusiastically recommended this book by Shelby Foote called The Civil War, a Narrative. And he said it was quite comprehensive, and it would probably take a couple months for me to read it. And I'll never forget what followed. I think those of us that knew Glen knew that he was a marvelous, really hilarious storyteller. And so Glen then regaled me with a detailed description, almost like a first-person type account, of the Battle of the Crater, which is also known as the Crater Fiasco. So briefly, the Crater was a campaign designed to destroy a Confederate fort in which the Union Army soldiers trenched below the fort, which they accomplished over the course of a month, very quietly and without arousing suspicion. And so by the time they dug to the end of the trench, you could actually hear the Confederate soldiers about 20 feet above their heads. And so the plan was to detonate 8,000 pounds of black powder under the fort, and then they would send basically 2 brigades of Union soldiers, so about 10,000 men, flanking the crater that would ensue and take care of the remainder of the Confederate army. And so they lit the fuse, and it went boom, like a really big boom, and it resulted in this huge crater, about 2/3 the size of a football field and up to 30 feet. And so chaos ensued. They weren't expecting such a large blast, and thousands of the Union soldiers actually ran into the crater, and it was described as that they were basically hip to hip, and they were unable to get out, and so from attack from above, which the Confederate Army did not neglect, resulting in a very embarrassing and lopsided defeat for the Union Army. So I'm like, yeah, I'm going to get the book. So I immediately ordered the book, started up again, and it came in a rather large box about 3 days later. I'm like, wow, what's that? And so I pull out the book, volumes, 3,000 pages, 2 million words. What Glen thought would take me just a few months to read took me about 3 years. So I listened to him in my car, going from place to place, and I would also read them at night. And after about 2.5 years, I finally got to the Battle of the Crater. The description was essentially what I was reading, and I think it was because I think Glen had a photographic memory. So I remember the Battle of the Crater because Glen taught it to me. He was an actually gifted, memorable teacher in all settings, whether for one person or in more formal lecture settings, in which he was really fun to listen to. So now when I hear anything about the Civil War, I think of Abraham Lincoln, I think of Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Glen Bowen. So Glen seemed to be interested in nearly everything, and so consequently he was really fun to travel with, and also in particular go to see museums with, because he wanted to see everything, kind of like me. So when Glen and I attended the Association of Professors of Dermatology meeting in Chicago, one afternoon we went to the spectacular Chicago Science and Industry Museum, and after seeing many of the exhibits and like sending tennis balls across the gallery, touring the German U-boat. It was like 15 minutes from closing time. And there was still one more thing that I really wanted to see, and that was an Omega Speedmaster wristwatch worn by Jim Lovell on the Apollo 8 space mission. But to get to the space exhibits, we had to walk through this really long hallway that had like exhibits on both sides. And I was doing a pretty good job, so I'm like, Glen, we need to really get there. And so, we were going, I was out in front, and keeping Glen from like veering off to look at these other exhibits. But then about midway through the tunnel, I look up to my left and I see this interactive exhibit that's a projector attached to the ceiling, which is projecting these kind of cascading beads, and then you could interact with them. And there was no one at this particular exhibit. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, no, Glen, do not like peel off and do that for any period of time. You wouldn't see it. And so, of course, he sees it, and because there's no one there, went and he with the exhibit and probably spent at least 5 minutes there. And what you don't really see in this video that I took at the time, and a few of the pictures, is that there were no people there at the beginning, but then after he was doing this for a while, kind of a small crowd developed. Who are now kind of gathered to watch, waiting for a turn, probably because he made it look interesting and fun. So Glen had this kind of like kid-like enthusiasm and curiosity for anything new and interesting. And so, at the end of the day, we had to essentially run through the hallway, the remainder of the hallway, to get to the space exhibits, but was able to actually see the watch. So that made the day really pretty awesome. So I was in the derm department one time in the hallway, and I see Glen coming toward me. And so he sees me and walks up to me and didn't say hi, Scott, or use any other kind of traditional greeting, but he just straight up asked me, he said, what do you know about quantum tunneling? So I'm thinking to myself, I'm actually a little bit flattered that he thought I could even know anything about that topic. I really don't know anything about quantum tunneling, Glen. So Glen went on to teach me some of the basic components of quantum mechanics, or the crazy kind of physics of subatomic particles. And quantum tunneling, as I understand it, is basically when an atom or a subatomic particle passes through like a seemingly solid barrier, kind of like if I walked, out of my house through the brick wall. And so not really explainable in a traditional sort of sense. But he went on to say that, this quantum tunneling is becoming more well known, that it's important in biological systems, such as our ability to smell or olfaction, but also in the way that birds can actually sense the magnetic field that encircles the Earth and allows them to navigate from place to place during migration. And so at that point, Glen recommended this other book that he had been reading called Life on the Edge, which of course, whenever Glen recommended a book to me, I immediately got it. And so this particular book describes these kind of phenomena and was also very interesting. And so that kind of struck me, that Glen really wanted to know how things worked, whether it was the mechanism of action of a new melanoma drug that he would explain to us in Melanoma Conference, or in this case, quantum physics. Glen always struck me as one who asked the big questions about life and tried to answer them for himself. So I learned a lot of very diverse things from my friend Glen Bowen over the 20 years that I knew him. Civil War history, quantum physics, Utah history and topography. Glen, by definition, I think was a polymath and seemed to be interested in pretty much anything and everything. Of course, he was a superb physician scientist whose active mind was always engaged in trying to figure out the best ways of treating skin cancer for his patients. He was a hilarious storyteller and was a role model in his teaching techniques and patient interaction. So yes, I miss Glen, but I remember him often. Thank you to the organizing committee of the 3rd Glen Bowen Symposium for giving me the opportunity to share a few personal remembrances of him.
Thank you, Scott. That was terrific. Still waiting on Jessica. So we'll go to Dave Wada has prepared a presentation. And so let me also mention to those of you who are viewing remotely, feel free to put in comments or brief stories in the chat. If we have some time at the end, we can read those. So let's go to Dr. Wada's presentation.
First of all, I want to thank Doug and Christina and Shante for giving me the privilege of presenting at Glen Bowen Symposium, and special thanks to Shante and Kaylee for assisting me with providing this talk on video. So when I first met Glen, I was a pathology resident over 20 years ago, and this was what our dermatology department consisted of. So it was a much different looking department at that time. And I was a pathology resident rotating in hematology when I performed bone marrow biopsies on several of Glen's patients, including this one, a patient who had carried the diagnosis of lupus profundus for several years, including on multiple biopsies, before she was referred to Glen. And Dr. Bowen, being the astute clinician that he is, had basically diagnosed her with a rare form of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, even before he had access to the outside biopsies or the interpretation of the biopsies he took in clinic. And so I was, first of all, very interested in the concept that the clinical exam findings can be more powerful than the pathology in the assessment of these patients. And so I approached Glen and asked him about how he was able to make that diagnosis so readily. And of course, Glen just spent several minutes discussing the differences between benign inflammatory paniculitis and malignant lymphoma, and how they can overlap, and how a clinician would make the distinction. And then he turned the conversation around, Glen being Glen, to ask me about T-cell development and the differences between T-cell genetics and T-cell phenotyping, so that he could understand more about these tests that he was ordering to optimize the care of his patients. And 10 years later, I returned to Salt Lake City and took over the service from Glen. And Glen, throughout the years, had repeatedly insisted that the lymphoma clinic must have the full support of an APC and nurse, given the complexity and the severity of the disease. Sometimes it required multidisciplinary care. And so he initially sacrificed his own resources when we were in clinic together, or at the same time. He provided me with his PA, which was initially Mark Hyde, and then nurse practitioner Marianne Bowling, and nurse who was initially Kalina Nolan, on his clinic day, which meant that he had less for himself. But that's the giving and thoughtful man that Glen was. So our team, has since evolved to its current state thanks to the foundation laid by Glen, and our consults and patient visits have risen considerably over the years. And over these years, while Glen and I were in clinic, he would often pull myself and other colleagues into his patient rooms to discuss his treatment plan and the diagnosis of melanoma, squamous cell carcinoma, sarcoma, or inflammatory conditions. Even though he was the most experienced physician, uh, most knowledgeable physician around, he really stood head and shoulders above us in terms of seniority. But he wanted to incorporate all of the information he could get his hands on to provide the best care for his patients. And in this photo on the left, he was literally standing above everyone. And on the right, these photos were provided by Micah. Kalina had dressed him up as a king, and he was being addressed as Your Majesty throughout the day while he wore that outfit. But if you knew Glen, you knew that Glen really did not see it that way at all. He treated everyone as his equal, all the time. Our current team consists of Marianne Bowling, who many of you know. She's the hub of the cutaneous lymphoma program, as well as our nurse Nick Sliding and Andrew Lamb, who was our nurse and is now in a nurse practitioner program. And we have MAs Frank Salcido and Chris Gottlieb, as well as administrative support by Veronica Brooks, Yanira Rodriguez, Micah, Madison, and Tristan, who also work with Doug and Decker and also support other MCOP services. And as far as multidisciplinary care, Glen had really set the standard for multidisciplinary care with frequent direct communication between providers of various fields that's needed to deliver optimal care for these complex patients. And so these are our multidisciplinary care participants currently. And I should mention that Glen, even after he had handed over the leadership of the program to me, had continued to staff our treatment planning conference, sacrificing his own time, coming in at 7 o'clock in the morning and blocking off a couple of his early morning patient visits so that he could assist me in leading one of the difficulties in our field is follicular tropic mycosis fungoides, which is a variant of mycosis fungoides, which is the most common form of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma that is notoriously difficult to treat. The survival is variable, and the lesions range from flat, non-palpable patches to small papules to infiltrative lesions and tumor stage disease that can be fatal. And so what Glen taught me regarding follicular tropic disease was how to optimize a multimodal approach to treatment. I had always preferred to treat follicular tropic mycosis fungoides more aggressively than conventional mycosis fungoides, but this approach was not necessarily routinely employed by many experts in the field. And so what Glen had already been doing was employing the combination of radiation therapy upfront to debulk the skin disease, followed by systemic maintenance. And this included the use of acitretin. And so subsequently, we had seen favorable outcomes to the point that we were able to publish a paper from our institution, a multidisciplinary group, demonstrating our experience with multimodal therapy, including acitretin, with really favorable outcomes. And Glen contributed heavily from the patient care aspect to this paper, but was unable to approve the manuscript based on the timing of the submission. How does this look in real life clinical practice? It's a patient with a highly unusual presentation of mycosis fungoides involving the hands, who had complete disability of the involved digit, was initially referred to Dr. Powell for evaluation of hand dermatitis. Dr. Powell knew right away that this was not typical of hand dermatitis, took a biopsy. The biopsy favored mycosis fungoides, referred the patient to my clinic, and I took additional biopsies to evaluate for the presence of follicular tropism and to determine the clinical extent of the disease. And we employed that treatment course that I had previously mentioned. So the patient received a modified total skin electron beam therapy regimen to the hands at HCI by our expert radiation oncologist, and this requires a high level of expertise with numerous complex physics and mathematical calculations to deliver a safe dose to a complex body region like the hand. And so this type of treatment is only restricted to, only available at referral centers. The radiation therapy was followed by acid treatment to maintain a response. And after a dose escalation and subsequent taper, the patient remained disease-free with complete return of function of his affected digit off of acid treatment 2 years later. So this was one of our success stories using the treatment regimen that Glen had employed. And if you think that this presentation is unique, well, you're correct, except for one paper published by our institution with familiar faces on this report, including Christina and Scott, with single-digit involvement by mycosis fungoides that was responsive to radiation therapy. So, in terms of treating advanced stages of mycosis fungoides, the treatment has evolved over the past few years. We know that conventional treatments of chemotherapy and radiation alone are of limited success and cannot be used repeatedly in high doses in the long term. And therefore, chemotherapy in and of itself is not an endpoint. But we have other treatments that demonstrate the success that has been noted in our field of treating advanced stage disease. So we use chemotherapy sparing regimens, including interferon, systemic retinoids, targeted chemotherapy, and immunotherapy. And this can even be more successful when used in combination with other modalities such as radiation therapy and photopheresis. So over the past 5 to 10 years, the field has evolved to employ a chemotherapy sparing approach, and in a multidisciplinary fashion led by Dr. Gaffney and one of his trainees, Matt Parsons, we published a paper demonstrating that there is an improved overall survival using a national database in advanced stage disease. So we are making some progress. And so how does this look in clinical practice? We have a patient with the diagnosis of stage 4 mycosis fungoides with significant blood involvement, with generalized patches and plaques, and suffered severe itching from her disease. She had undergone numerous treatments over the course of several years after being referred to our clinic, and finally a newer drug called mogamulizumab was initiated, which is an anti-CCR4 humanized monoclonal antibody that can target tumor cells, including mycosis fungoides and in particular Sézary syndrome that highly express CCR4, as well as regulatory T cells that serve as a brake for the anti-tumor immune response. So in essence, the drug leads to targeted destruction of tumor cells and release of the brake on anti-tumor immunity, thereby creating a pro-inflammatory systemic response. And so our patient, treated by Dr. Halwani with mogamulizumab, had noted significant blood response that was sustained over the last 2 years. Mogamulizumab had been discontinued only 8 months after treatment due to a rash, followed by concerns for recurrence of mycosis fungoides, and she was set up for treatment with pralatrexate and potentially followed by CAR T therapy under a clinical trial. So we had her return urgently to Marianne's clinic for a skin evaluation, and you can see the clinical morphology of the primary disease and the drug rash was somewhat overlapping with her, especially when you look at the evolution to patch and plaque disease. So biopsies needed to be performed with very careful clinical correlation, and of course, we had to have close communication between dermatology, medical oncology, pathology, in the fashion that Glen had set up for us. And in doing so, we were able to optimize care for this patient because the drug rash can histologically be identical to mycosis fungoides. Our pathologist performed immunophenotyping, confirmed that most of this erythema was actually drug-induced rash mimicking mycosis fungoides. And for localized biopsy-proven areas of mycosis fungoides, she was treated with radiation therapy. The rash itself was responsive to steroids. We were able to avoid chemotherapy and CAR T therapy, and she had a sustained response in the skin and blood, and has now returned to normal activities 6 years post diagnosis with excellent control of her itch. A multi-center study on mogamulizumab-related skin eruptions is underway, headed by a medical oncologist, Dr. Hu, at the University of North Carolina. Our group is contributing to this study. The results were presented at the ASH conference, and the presence of this rash appears to be strongly correlated with favorable outcomes in treatment of the disease. So the success of our cutaneous lymphoma program can really be strongly attributed to the foundation that was laid by Glen. And Glen had also built on previous years of work that John and Marta had contributed to our field as well. But I have to say that before Glen left us, he mentioned to me how happy he was with how we were running the program. And while I didn't think that much of it at the time, those words have really fueled me through adversity and challenges since then. And I have to say that Glen is really one of the rare people that I've ever met that has truly inspired everyone that he knew to be better, both professionally and personally, in some way. And he really left a positive, indelible impression on virtually everyone.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. Our next presentation is Dr. Donegan. Those of you watching from home, I should warn you, you should probably have your kids leave the room because I understand this presentation contains some very adult content.
It doesn't.
Oh, you took it out? Okay. Is this your first slide?
So if I have like a video with sound, do I need to mute anything? No, here. Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm late. It turns out it snows a lot at 7,000 feet and it's complete bedlam up there. So I'm just glad that I made it. I'm Jessica Donegan. I'm one of the Mohs surgeons here. And I've been bothering the department here since I was a visiting medical student and then an internal medicine resident. And then I did my residency here. So I was fortunate enough to know Glen, and he was one of my main mentors when I was a resident. So Thanks to Doug for inviting me to speak. I'm really honored. And I have to thank Ryan Kiernan, who was one of Glen's longtime medical assistants up at Huntsman. And he provided me with a lot of the slide photos and videos in my presentation. So Glen, as I'm sure you all agree, was one of the smartest people I knew. He was a great Mohs surgeon and dermatologist. He knew just a lot about medicine in general, but he also knew a lot about cars and motorcycles and nature and everything in between. But he never made anyone feel stupid. He just wanted to hear what you had to say and was interested in learning from you just as much as you were in learning from him. And he was able to get to know everyone and make everyone feel involved. He was really good at accents and telling jokes. Whenever I was in clinic with him, he would have the patient in stitches. But while his medical assistants were in the back just groaning because they had heard the same jokes over and over again. He was a crossword enthusiast. He got everyone involved in doing the New York Times crossword puzzles. Here he is with Felicia, who was a longtime histotechnician for us, and is now the manager of our laboratory services operations. Hope I got that right. Glen was a great educator. He's a great teacher. So he taught medical students and residents and fellow physicians, but teaching patients was also very important to him. So up at Huntsman, there's a whiteboard in every room. And he would use that to teach people about their diagnosis and treatment options. And when it came to Mohs, he would illustrate how he planned to repair their defects. So here's one of his drawings of how he was going to shift the skin on the side of the nose forward to fill in that defect. He had a great relationship with everyone, especially all of his staff members. And in clinic, he always had people in a room together. And I really don't know how they got any work done with all of his shenanigans.
Just a little to your right.
Something bad is happening.
Gives you a headache after a while.
But with all the crossword puzzles and other shenanigans, Glen was an excellent dermatologist, an excellent Mohs surgeon, and he devoted a lot of his career to lentigo maligna. So I know there's a lot of non-medical people watching today, some of which may have had lentigo maligna, but just a little background, it's a type of melanoma in situ, meaning that it's just in the top layer of the skin, considered to be a stage 0. And it occurs on chronically sun-damaged skin. And because of this, it has a predilection for the head and neck, and also for more elderly patients who've had a lifelong exposure to the sun. So it does have a risk of becoming invasive, meaning leaving the top layer of the skin, becoming deeper. And that becomes a problem because if it becomes deep enough, it can enter blood vessels and lymphatic channels and spread other places. And that's how people die of melanoma. And so we do want to treat these, even though they're considered to be kind of a lower risk melanoma. Unfortunately, that risk of invasion is really unknown. Reports range from 5 to 50%. So we kind of just have to treat them to avoid that risk. Surgery is the main treatment, with a 5mm margin being the standard to start with. But these melanomas often have what's called extensive subclinical spread. So meaning you see the melanoma as a brown spot, but there's melanoma beyond that that you can't see with your naked eye. And so it's been reported that even a 12mm margin is required to clear 97% of these tumors. So you can imagine that if that's on the face, that's going to be pretty large. But also because a lot of patients are elderly or have other underlying illnesses, they may not tolerate surgery. And so there are non-surgical treatments available for lentigo maligna, radiation, and imiquimod being the main things. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. So in case people don't know what lentigo maligna looks like, this was a photo that Glen would often show of FDR, because it's speculated that he had a lentigo maligna above his left eyebrow. So this is a pretty classic presentation of a lentigo maligna with this ill-defined pigmented patch with kind of various shades of brown within it. So as you can imagine, taking a 12 mm margin all the way around this is going to have significant, not only cosmetic morbidity, but also probably functional morbidity as it would encroach onto the eyelid. So as I mentioned, imiquimod is one of the non-surgical treatments for lentigo maligna. It's an immunomodulating cream, which means it stimulates your own immune system to target viruses such as the human papillomavirus, which causes warts, but also in cancer such as lentigo maligna. And how it works within lentigo maligna is it actually inhibits the melanocytes, which are the cells that cause melanoma, in inhibiting their creation of the pigment. Also, it causes them to kind of eat themselves, what's called autophagy, and cell death, which is called apoptosis. And in fact, one of the potential side effects of imiquimod is vitiligo, even at sites distant from the application site, meaning that you're losing all your melanocytes. And we do sometimes see that when we treat patients with imiquimod prior to surgery, and they come back for surgery and then we look at their skin under the microscope, sometimes we do see a complete loss of their melanocytes. So it's used off-label, meaning that it doesn't have FDA approval for this particular reason, either as a single agent or an adjuvant treatment in addition, usually to surgery for lentigo maligna. But when it's used alone, it has a relatively high recurrence rate, about 20%, whereas surgery has a less than 10% recurrence rate. So Glen had been researching lentigo maligna since 2002 and publishing since that time with multiple publications on the topic. And his goal really was to minimize the cosmetic morbidity that treatment for lentigo maligna can have, especially on the face. So often, because these are large patches, the referring dermatologist doesn't want to biopsy the whole thing. So they'll do a partial biopsy to get the diagnosis. And so when the patients presented to Glen, they often had residual pigment, which he would remove to rule out invasive melanoma, because obviously if they had invasive melanoma, you don't want to dilly-dally, you just want to do surgery and not mess around. So after he had ruled out invasion, he would have the patient treat with imiquimod cream for 3 months, with the frequency depending on the patient's inflammatory response. So after the 3 months, they would stop treatment, let the inflammation calm down, and then the patient returned to clinic for surgery with frozen section examination with a 2 mm margin. So again, the standard is to start with a 5 mm margin. So he was starting with that smaller margin. So frozen section examination is where we look at the tissue in clinic while the patient's waiting. And this is most commonly used in a technique called Mohs micrographic surgery, where the cancer is cut out kind of in a dish shape, it's taken to the lab, it's frozen by our histotechnician, and then it's cut on FOSS, meaning from kind of the bottom up. And what that allows us to do is look at 100% of the margin, which gives it a really high cure rate. And if the tumors or the specimen's small enough, you can actually see the entire thing in a single viewpoint as demonstrated there. But what Glen liked to do for these melanomas is actually cut them radially. So he would still cut the tumor out in a disc and then take it to the lab where it was quadrisected. And then each quadrant is cut into little tiny radial sections, like little pie wedges. And then those are inked for mapping purposes so that if there is any tumor left, you know where to go back and take more on the patient. He would often also take a negative control. So in picture A, that little kind of sliver above the quadrisected specimen is a negative control, which is taken from sun damage but non-involved skin to act as a control to let us know what is normal for that patient. Because when you've had a lot of sun exposure, you're going to have increased number of melanocytes. You can even have atypical melanocytes. And so this helps us know, okay, this is normal for the patient. We don't need to take anymore. And I'll show you in a few slides why Glen really liked these radial sections for melanoma. So the tissue is always stained with hematoxin and eosin. It's our standard stain. But melanocytes are really difficult to see on H&E because there can be just a lot of artifact from the freezing of the tissue. And so in this specimen, you can actually see that there is melanoma, but it's not super obvious, especially to an untrained eye. And so we do special stains on these melanomas that make it much easier. So this is the same specimen with a stain called MART, 1. And so all of these brown cells are melanoma. So it just makes it much easier to see. So MART1 is a cytoplasmic stain, meaning that it stains the majority of the melanoma cell, as well as its dendritic processes, which are like little finger-like projections that come off the melanocyte. So because of that, it can be a little bit murky. It just makes things look a little bit busier, and sometimes can make you think that there's melanoma when maybe there isn't. So we also do a stain called SOX10, which is a nuclear stain. So it stains just one little specific part of the cell. So it's much crisper and cleaner. And so this is a different specimen, but showing why Glenn really liked the radial sections. So to the left side of the screen, that would be the center of the specimen. So where you'd see the biopsy scar or potentially any residual melanoma. And then to the right side of the screen, that would be our peripheral margin. And you can see here that there's melanoma in the center, but we have this nice long area of normal skin with a nice clear margin. And why this is really important for lentigo maligna is because they notoriously have skip areas where you see melanoma, normal skin, melanoma, normal skin. So it's not as nice of a cutoff as a lot of other tumors. And so if there were any skip areas, the radial section really allows you to see that and make sure that you are seeing the taper off of the melanoma. So we looked at patients over 8 years with an average time to follow-up of 5.5 years. And we saw a recurrence rate of 3.9%, which is really consistent with other studies, which are reported to be 0 to 10%, excuse me, 0 to 10% recurrence rate for these melanomas after surgery. But the big thing and how Glenn really achieved his goal is that the average margin was 3.5 millimeters, which is much smaller than a 7.1 millimeter reported in the literature. And again, the difference between 3 and 7 may not sound that big, but if you're taking that all the way around the tumor, especially on the face, that's a big deal. It's a 50% reduction. And so a smaller wound, smaller scar, less cosmetic morbidity. So when Glenn died, my colleagues and I had to fill in for him. And while no one will ever fill Glenn's shoes, we're all committed to still caring for these patients with lentigo maligna and continuing our research efforts. So one of the things that I noticed when I started taking care of these patients with lentigo maligna is that when they come back for surgery, a lot of the people who still had melanoma after they had treated with imiquimod had follicular extension. Follicular extension is a hallmark of lentigo maligna, and so that's when the melanoma goes down the hair follicle. It's seen about 97% of cases, so a majority of them. But I did notice that these cases who had residual melanoma did have a lot of follicular extension. I also noted that the cases that would pre-treat and then come for surgery and we'd take more shallow specimens, maybe trying to let the wound heal in on its own, they had a higher rate of recurrence, especially on areas with a higher density of hair follicles, such as the nose. So there are conflicting studies on the efficacy of imiquimod on follicular lentigo maligna, with one study reporting that it actually had a positive response when there was follicular extension. And then another study saying that there was really no difference in response, whether there was follicular extension or not. But it would make sense to me that there wouldn't be as much response because the hair follicle is an immune privileged site, meaning that it's kind of protected from our body's immune response to things. So I'm working with a few medical students doing a retrospective chart review to look at the implications of follicular involvement on the efficacy of imiquimod. So unfortunately, follicular involvement is not always reported. And so we'll identify cases via chart review, and then we'll have to look at slides to really look at this. So I'm not the only one continuing research on this. Dr. Frigerio is going to do a study looking at the kind of difference with using citrate and how it affects our staining, but also Dr. Decker Deacon, who's here today and was also one of our past residents here. and now an attending physician, is doing more laboratory research on this. So he's looking at known melanoma-associated genes and comparing the profiles between lentigo maligna and lentigo maligna melanoma, its invasive counterpart, to see if there's any difference or similarity. He's also looking at any association with these gene profiles and the risk of recurrence and metastasis. So I don't have time to talk about his research, and honestly, I don't understand it because he's an MD PhD, so it's above my head. But this is a picture he sent us, which I just thought was so beautiful. I have no idea what it's showing us, but I felt like it belongs on the wall of a modern art museum. So maybe next year Decker can talk about his research and his results. So lastly, another way that Glen's legacy is being carried on is again by Ryan. So Ryan left us and he's at OHSU now working with the dermatology department up there. And Ryan and Glen really bonded over their love for motorsports and racing and all of that sort of thing. So he teamed up with a colleague at OHSU and they are participating in the 24 Hours of Lemons races, which is a series for just normal people racing cars that had a $500 limit. So they bought this 1996 Chevy S10 for $500, and they are working to get all of the safety gear, which is required to race, but not part of the $500 limit. And they named it Lentigo, which I thought was pretty clever. So here's him towing it to his place up there in Portland, stripping it out, and just notice the Utah license plates. So you can take the boy out of Utah, but you can't take Utah out of the boy. And then this is a more recent picture. Oh shoot, it got cut off. I had the website up top, but this is a more recent picture with it painted, saying melanoma stands out. You could spot cancer. If you look closely, they actually have seats now with some seat belts. So they're working on their way, but he's done so well raising money that it's actually now like a real nonprofit charity thing. I had the website up top for people if they were interested, but it's cut off by that bar. So I don't know if people online can see that, but oh, they can. Okay, well, if you're interested, check out the website. So again, Glen was able to bring everyone together. He brought people together in clinic and at his cabin and here today. And so with that, I'll let him walk us out.
Putting out all this ATP and going backwards. I think I'm going forward, I'm going backwards. Want to go forward?
These are my references. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica, for that wonderful presentation. Christina Calistuffin unfortunately could not be here because of a family event, but she sent a message in the chat here, and so I'm just going to read it. I'm so sorry I couldn't join the symposium and be there with all of you today. We're so grateful for Doug, Scott, Dave, and Jessica for sharing their beautiful stories, a small sampling of Glen's many gifts, his intense curiosity, creativity, his spirit, his passion, most of all, his passion, and most of all, his compassion. He'll always be remembered as a treasured husband, father, doctor, researcher, teacher, and friend. Thanks everyone for joining today. And I think we'll conclude our program. Thanks everybody for attending.